talking about things like time horizons, we're talking about public perceptions of what companies are, and we're talking about where our themes of impact investing fit in with these questions that we've been hearing about through the day as a side theme of this disconnect between companies and what people think of them. So I don't think you were here earlier when Martin Whittaker was talking about the work that the Just Capital have done.
I'm familiar with it.
But you're familiar with it. So those, I think most of my audience were here, but just to briefly recap, polling members of the public in America and asking them what do they think a just company is. And the answers are things that are overwhelmingly to do with the way they treat their workers, but also people don't feel that companies are just. And at the same time, there's this big movement in impact investing towards getting companies to think longer term horizons, to think about their impact. And that isn't cutting through. There isn't a connection there. So does this resonate with you?
Well, to the first point, the data, the recent consumer data, particularly millennials, would say that 75% of the public is of the view that business leaders are primarily focused on their own financial agenda, as opposed to any societal.
Like their own personal financial agenda.
Yes. As opposed to any societal objective. And 50% of leaders generally are focused on non-societal agendas. So this in the context of business and industry, which employs 125 million of the 145 million people in the United States, as an example, is obviously highly problematic. I think part of the challenge for the public in general is reflected in the poll we just saw up there, which is there's a lot of marketing that goes on around purpose and social agenda that's fundamentally greenwashing. It's not actually measured. No one's held accountable to it. ESG in the investing world has come dangerously close to becoming a box-checking exercise for institutions, because LPs are asking that everyone have a point of view on ESG, and so you go through and have a point of view on ESG, and the measurements are not really agreed upon. There's no common standard for what it means. Impact's even more challenging. There hasn't been, if you think about the human race, in the last 50 years, you'd argue business hasn't worked particularly well for we the people. If you look at our environment, you look at the dynamic in some ways. In the other end of the spectrum, employment and economic opportunity, as evidenced in China, has driven 450 million people out of extreme poverty. So there are elements of it that are excruciatingly powerful. So we see the potential, and I think people in general believe in that, but we've not had a way of actually holding the beast that is capitalism accountable to a broader set of agendas as a society. It's sort of surprising to me that we've waited this long, but I think the general tilt and the mood of the world, as evidenced by the political discussion today in the UK, in the US, et cetera, is people are now expecting a lot of the comments Paul Pullman would make, that if a business doesn't have a purpose, it probably shouldn't be. The only question then is, what is that purpose, and how do you measure it in a way that deals with the bugaboo that has been externalities?
I sort of feel like even then, even when everybody registers that they need to talk about more than short-term profit or more than what the people at the top of the company earn, the conversations go past each other. So on the one side, you've got people saying, rightly, we need to think about the long-term future of the planet. We need to make sure that we keep to 1.5 degrees warming. And then on the other side, what we are hearing is people saying, I want a decent healthcare plan. I think you're screwing me over on the minimum wage. You're not letting me choose my hours. Those sorts of things. And I strongly feel that disconnect furthers, creates a wider gap than if people here just aren't even listening, It's like they're driving past each other in the night. Is there a way that they can kind of...
And what's often missed in that conversation is, again, the fundamental impact of the business engine itself.
Yes.
So when you look at climate as an example, we're now down to 3 to 4 cents per kilowatt for renewable sources of energy. Versus 4 to 8 for fossil fuels. So renewable energy is materially better commercially. You're going to see 2/3 of all energy be renewable by 2050 versus 2/3 today being fossil fuel. And that's $8 trillion of investment that's going on, not out of the goodness of anyone's heart, but because it's good business at this point. So, when we have the debates, I think on a social level, we're much more willing to have the debates in our society about pay levels and compensation and healthcare, because it's very personal. What we often forget is the implications of these of these business models, what it's doing to our society, what it's doing to the environment. And I think the key change will be when we actually start looking at every business and have a lens that says, what are the effects of this business? Quantified, measurable, transparent, reportable, auditable. It changes everything.
So somebody said to me in the break, in a way, impact investing, I mean, all investing has impact. It just does. That's what the word impact means. So maybe it's not so much about trying to define the specific types of impact that we want, although that's important too, but just thinking, as you say, all the impacts that you're...
Well, to your point, it's fascinating to think about that, right? Every investment does have an impact. You have $2.5 trillion in the private equity industry overall. That's all having an impact. The question is, what's the degree? And can we, in fact, direct capital in a way that has a higher degree of impact? It happens at a societal level even more dramatically. We in America spend 65% of all healthcare dollars in the last 6 months of life. Now that's an investment decision. There aren't infinite amounts of money available. We've all learned that the hard way. So here we sit as a people, and we have unconsciously made the investment decision to put all of our money into that last 6 months of life, our investable dollars. Now we could have chosen early childhood education. We could have chosen a smart grid. We could have chosen growth infrastructure. There's a lot of interesting choices. And if we were to lay out a table in front of everybody that said, what is the return on investment of each of those from a societal perspective, objectively, not politics, not religion, but what is the objective measure of outcome in each of those choices? I think it would be a fascinating discipline. And by the way, if you want to eat, my wife is anti-GMO, and there are people that would debate her point of view. The one thing it's hard to debate is, should we allow labeling? In other words, do you as a consumer have the right to choose if you want to experiment with that or not? It should be your choice, and it should be the same choice around where we choose to invest our capital. All of that capital, $2.5 trillion sitting in bank accounts that's not invested, that's just sitting there earning a fixed income. When you start realizing that every investment has an impact, there's an imperative to go do something with your money. But none of us have the guidelines to tell us where to go do something. And so I think the pioneers in the impact world, some of them are here today, who've really launched this whole movement, that started with the Rockefeller Foundation way back and labeling this impact investing. What they were pointing to is the fact that if in fact we could agree on a standard of measurement, and if we could see the effect that the durable engine of innovation and commerce can deliver, there could be real promise that we can address these issues in a way that works. Today, with the gap in the SDGs, which is 2.7 trillion a year, we're not even close to getting there with government and philanthropy. We have to activate business.
So tell us a little bit about what Rise Fund does then in this space.
Yep. So I started the Rise Fund with Bono and Jeff Skoll as my co-founders within the TPG business that I manage, TPG Growth. And we spent the first year and a half of the startup effort figuring out if we could measure impact. So it started with, could we in fact leverage the work that many in the industry had already done, a great job of advancing around how you measure, groups like Omidyar and Jeff Skoll and others who joined the effort here with the Rise Fund. Could we do it in a credible way that would pass muster with institutional capital? We then went out and raised the first Rise Fund, which is $2.1 billion. Of capital, and we did it largely with non-impact money. So it was Washington State Pension Fund, New York Common, SF, ERS, LGT, Bank of America, et cetera. And the reason for doing that is we wanted that $10 trillion of capital that those LPs represented sitting around the table as we developed this method of investing and measuring impact in a way that would then ideally create a whole lot of competitors, activate all of that really scale institutional capital to realize that number one, the impact and return could be collinear. These didn't have to be in conflict, and by the way, they're not. We can now say with real evidence that we can deliver returns and impact. We're delivering top quartile financial returns while also delivering a 13 times multiple of money on impact. So our $2 billion will generate $26 billion of measurable social and environmental value audited by KPMG with a third-party measurement methodology. As of 3 weeks ago in Davos, we announced that we've spun out the measurement system. It's called Y Analytics. There's a CEO of Y Analytics, Marianne Hancock, who's a former senior partner of McKinsey, a chief economist who's a tenured professor at the London School of Economics, Greg Fisher. We have a team of researchers. We have partnerships at Chicago, MIT, LSE, other places, and an editorial board that includes Laura DeAndrea Tyson and Ed Zimmer, the president of Chicago, and an august group of academic leaders on the methodology, and that's now available for everybody to use. So we're effectively, hopefully, creating a bunch of competitors who do scale impact funds, and it's needed because this gap I mentioned before is going to be much bigger than anything we could ever address as a firm.
So do you think this sort of thing will manage to cut through to people who feel that businesses aren't just? Or do you just think that, again,
I think
metaphor of these things going past each other?
What's been stunning for us is the level of excitement, particularly millennial entrepreneurs have around what we're doing.
Yeah.
You know, what gives me great encouragement is there's a whole generation of folks that are frankly the majority in the world today who believe you should be able to integrate purpose and what you do every day in your life. And it's the old model of I'm going to make money, raping and pillaging, and then give it away is no longer tolerated by that generation. And that's an old way of thinking. And it's remarkable the level of excitement around this, the level of institutional demand. And we have far more capital that wants to be in Rise 2, which is, we're closing this month on fresh capital, much more capital than we could ever take in the fund from the most important institutional capital in the world. So the level of excitement, I think we're at a point in time where people in general are ready to ask the hard question about whether a business is having impact in the first instance, and secondly, want to understand and get behind those businesses that are really delivering outcomes that are important.
So earlier we had one of the panels, which was if you had $1 billion to invest in impact, where would you invest it? And I mean, actually, you're
in the Rise Fund, of course.
Well, you're someone who has actually done that. Basically, yep. You've had to decide where to.
Oh, you don't mean in the fund? You mean it?
I mean, yeah, I meant like in education, right. Or
yes.
Whatever. What's the right answer to that question?
So what's been so encouraging is we've covered all the same sectors that we've been doing as a firm
right.
for years now, for 17 years, all over the world. We invest in India, China, Africa, Latin America, US, et cetera, across healthcare, education, financial services, conservation, energy, renewables, technology as a horizontal. Mm-hmm. And what's so fascinating is when you develop a way of actually measuring the impact, you can go after derivative and second derivative impact that result from these businesses, as opposed to being limited to investing in the obvious.
So what do you mean? What are the derivatives?
So C3 IoT is a company, if you guys are familiar with Siebel Systems, it was the first CRM system mm-hmm. that was acquired by Oracle. Tom Siebel is one of these badass entrepreneurs who built this thing, multi-billionaire. He started something called C3, which is carbon, C3. And the whole intent was to use AI and the Internet of Things to create more efficiency. Mm-hmm. So he applied this first to the largest utility in the world, which happens to be Italy's utility, and got a 15% reduction in carbon out of that utility. This is massive amounts of conservation. He's now applying it to healthcare, predicting diabetes in the healthcare systems using AI and, again, IoT to deliver that. So there's an interesting example. It's a very sophisticated business where when we made the investment, the editor of Impact Alpha came and said, Bill, I thought that's what you were going to do. You guys raise the money for impact, and then you go do a tech deal that has nothing to do with impact. We sat down and went through the data. Look, this isn't our word. Here's the information.
Right.
Here's the impact.
So he genuinely thought that this was kind of a fraud.
Well, it looks like it, right?
Right.
And that's part of the reason that impact funds historically did bottom of the pyramid healthcare,
yes.
education for the poor, even something like micro-lending. There are micro-lending businesses that are usurious, yes. that don't create a net uplift in household income. That's not impact. If you're charging an interest rate, or if the loan is not being used to create a productive improvement in that family's life, that's not impact. Mm-hmm. So you have to have a way of actually cutting through the intention, and instead, with proper humility, deliver real impact that you're held accountable to. That's not my word, that's not my intention, but rather is validated and real. Mm-hmm. And that's what's been missing historically. So there's an example, we see it all over the place, and the level of impact is what's so encouraging. We went into this with a threshold of 2.5 times necessary for a deal to be in the Rise Fund. So unless you were at a 2.5 times multiple of money on impact over our investment period, and this is incremental impact, not legacy, but that which is derived during our hold period, it couldn't go in the Rise Fund. Otherwise, it went into the Growth Fund. Same financial underwriting, but that's the cutoff. We're at 13 times, not 2.5.
So that's your cutoff, basically, in effect.
Yeah, but we're not even, we're not cutting off at 13. We would do lower deals than that. We have a deal called Wilderness Safari that's a 9 times impact deal. It's the largest safari company in the world. We have stewardship over 6 million acres of land in Africa. We're doing all the ecosystem preservation, preventing deforestation, hiring 2,600 local indigenous communities. We were using a green bond to buy 1.2 million more acres in Zimbabwe to do the same thing, preserve the largest population of black rhino in the world. Wonderful stuff. It's only nine times our money, right? It's fantastic, right? Yeah. So there's so much opportunity.
Are you seeing the copying that you hoped to see?
Well, KKR is out raising an impact fund. Partners Group is raising an impact fund. LGT is raising an impact fund. You have corporations like Bank of America, who's an LP, that is actually now thinking about their $180 billion of investing capital as impact capital and asking Y Analytics to do the impact underwriting. It's fantastic. It's a little contrarian within my firm, I'll have to confess, that people say how great that we're helping our competitors in the space, but it's obviously what's needed. And at some point, I think over the next 5 years, you're going to see a tipping point where, to your earlier comment, it's just investing.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I mean, some people talk about how we need to stop talking about impact investing as being anything separate, and you're just talking about the lens that you're looking at all you're investing through, and that it becomes routine that you would think about things like...
Well, that's only possible if we hold the industry accountable.
Yeah.
In other words, the real risk with the TPG doing this is, and with the profile of Bono and Queen Rania and Jeff Skoll and Richard Branson and everyone else that's involved, is that everyone looks at it as a honeypot to be able to raise a lot of money. And honestly, I can tell you truthfully, I never would have done this to raise money, because I could have raised a lot more money a lot more easily out of the core growth business, where we always deliver top quartile return. So this has been a lot. In fact, I was just asked by the CIO of the Federal Reserve, why did you do this?
Yeah, why did you do this? Go on.
Right, what was the point? So much work, why do the effort? My journey here began starting a nonprofit right out of college. I moved to Dar es Salaam. I was backed by UNDP, United Nations Development Program, and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund to start something called World Service Corps. And I moved over there, and I spent the 5 years of my life trying to have an impact as an NGO, as a nonprofit. And the clear conclusion that I arrived at, that I think all of us can sort of see transparently, is with philanthropy and government alone, we're not going to get there. Yeah. I mean, Africa is a $20 million jobs a year demographic problem. It's what's creating the Brexit issue, ultimately, the refugee challenge. And by the way, if Africa goes, so goes Europe at the end of the day. So unless we find a way a lot more productively than what philanthropy and government alone can provide, we're not going to get there. And that was my conclusion. I went back to Stanford Business School, went down the path of investing in this all over the world from the beginning. The missing ingredient was not, in fact, Sir Ronnie Cohen said to me, who's involved with us, said to me, Bill, you've been doing investments with impact for years and years. What you haven't been doing is impact investing, and there is the distinction. Because unless you ex ante commit to deliver impact, ex ante is the key. This isn't after the fact rewriting history, but up front, I'm committing to the level of impact I'm delivering, ex ante. It's not my word, it's someone else's word. It's based on third-party data. It's reviewed, it's reported, it's audited. It's not actually impact investing. And what will change when it becomes investing is when every investment is held accountable in that way. So you ought to see, IRR, risk, return, and impact on every deal going forward. And we ought to hold every investment accountable to that lens. And it's going to be fascinating to see what happens. When you start seeing someone delivering a return, but they've got a negative impact of XYZ billions of dollars a year of negative societal impact, I think it's going to be fascinating to watch what happens.
So that's connected to something that came up in one of my panels earlier, which is that in some ways, when you're doing responsible investing or impact investing, that involves you divesting, getting out of certain industries. Yep. But by doing that, you're leaving unserved. I mean, the example that we were talking about was getting out of fossil fuels when they're the things that fuel grids, and there are nearly a billion people who don't have light, who don't have connection to the grid. Yep. So is there a way of connecting via this impact lens or this IRR approach, what you stop doing and seamlessly what you should start doing as well? Is there a way
Totally.
of
Well,
connecting
the
those?
beauty of this is the impact multiple of money is a net figure.
Right.
So when Larry Fink announced that BlackRock is divesting from Walmart, it was an interesting, I get the point, given what guns are doing in our society and the implications, but at the same time, Walmart's selling alcohol that kills as many people per year from drunk driving as die from handguns. And by the way, it's been selling cigarettes for 100 years. So the interesting question is, what is the impact of Walmart? And we went and did the work. Outside in, we came up with an impact report on Walmart Corporation. It turns out Walmart delivers billions of dollars of impact annually.
Where does that mostly come from? Like, what are the big ticket items?
Well, one of them is actually affordable nutrition.
Yeah.
It turns out what they've done, and particularly they've had a dramatic effect on the organic industry by, addressing the supply chain. That's just one. There are 18 different pathways that are positive, and there are about 12 that are negative, and you end up with a net number. That wilderness safari business, I shamefully left out the negative impact. The thing that creates the net number of about 9x on wilderness is the fact that when guests come to our resorts, they fly around on planes, and there's a carbon footprint. So unless you look at the true net number, the same point on energy that you're making, there is a positive impact of energy, fossil fuels or otherwise, that from a societal perspective. Now it has to do with, is it novel? So if you're coming into a market and producing fossil fuels in a market where there's otherwise energy, all you have is a negative effect from carbon.
But if you're turning the lights on for the first time in a village,
there's real impact.
Yes.
That doesn't mean it's a net positive.
Sure.
Because there's a cost of carbon. Interestingly, in the pricing of carbon, even today, if you look at Stanford's price or the EU's price of carbon, they don't count extreme weather in the cost of carbon.
Right.
It's not even in there. And there are lots of elements of carbon's cost, but until we get serious about quantifying, I mean, this is something interesting talking to the economists, because this is an issue for the economists. It's a practical issue that needs to be addressed. Until we price these externalities effectively and have a way of actually quantifying them, it's really hard to make the right judgment calls around what is contributive and what is deleterious.
So when I was at university, one of my friends was studying to be a doctor, and there was a guy in her class who was famous because in the rounds, the first day he went on rounds, he was meant to be listening to this patient presenting her symptoms, and then the doctor turned to him and said, what do you think it is? And he said, we'll have to wait for the post-mortem. So, in front of the patient. So I think that the problem...
Great bedside
he
manner
shouldn't
there.
have become a doctor. So I think the problem with that...
Hedge fund investor. Should have been a hedge fund investor.
So there was a sort of a strained analogy with, we're not going to know what the impact is until it's happened. So I don't know if that's part of the issue here, that we're kind of making up numbers a bit here.
What's beautiful about the context in which we're now, and I don't think this is coincidental, I think this is, if you think about our journey, we spent a year and a half figuring out if we could underwrite this. And for us as underwriters, all day, every day, we go and underwrite risk.
Yeah.
We underwrite. If you look at what's in an IRR, it's a lot more complicated than you think. What's in GDP, a lot more complicated than you think. This is not as complicated as many of those underwriting factors. And interestingly, at J. Powell alone, the poverty labs at MIT, there are over 1 million studies. The beauty is that the governments and philanthropies and corporations have already done the work. The data's already there. Shockingly, we were the first organization to actually curate the data. So whenever a deal comes along, we have to go through and look at what is the effect. So Dreambox, which is run by this wonderful woman, Jessie, is the most advanced algorithmic learning platform in the world. They go in and they take math learning and they do it algorithmically. So those of you who have kids in a classroom, when a teacher's up there talking to the kids, 50% are bored because it's behind their level, 50% are completely confused, and there might be one kid who's getting it just right.
Yeah.
This platform customizes the learning pathway. There are over 1 million pathways for each kid. So it learns how you're learning and adjusts as it goes. The potential to affect education, not just here, but everywhere, is extraordinary. They've achieved a 30% uplift in attainment. And it turns out there's not only that data, but there's tremendous data that says with attainment increases in basic skills like mathematics, English learning, et cetera, you get higher income. So there's a way to actually quantify this now. It's not theoretical. This is all underwritable. You can go through and underwrite the implications of this business, what will the effect be, and then you can actually review what the effects were. So there's an ex-ante underwriting, and then there's a follow-up where you're held accountable. Our underwriting is wrong almost every time. It's always wrong. It's wrong on financial terms, it's wrong on impact terms. Then we report on what actually happened. we are actually ahead of what we underwrote overall.
Right.
We're behind on some companies, we're ahead on others. The integrity in it is actually being forced to report on it and say what actually happened. Did we in fact deliver at the level? Usually when we're wrong, it's because the core financial underwriting was wrong. The output, we didn't hit as many patients as we thought. Or the new drug that cures cataracts with eye drops is behind its phase 3 clinical development cycle. Things of that sort, as opposed to the impact was.
Right, it wasn't the calculation,
No.
right. No. It's absolutely fascinating. I've got to leave time for a couple of questions because I'm sure there are some. Okay, I have 2 hands up. I have 2 more, but I'll keep it super short, would you? Have we got mics coming? Yeah. So just shoot your question out and then we'll keep the answers short too because I think quite a few people want to.
Thanks very much. Delilah Rothenberg with Development Capital Strategies. We advise investors on ESG integration and impact strategy. I love the idea of impact at scale in private equity, but when we talk about making a net positive impact and when we talk about wealth inequality, I'm concerned about large private equity funds charging 2 and 20 on $1 billion or $3.5 billion funds and exacerbating wealth inequality.
Okay, so wealth inequality.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd make 2 comments. This might sound a little glib. I think if we have to charge 2 and 20, Bono, very unfortunately, at the Skoll Forum, he was given this Golden Treasure Award by Jeff Skoll. And he started, you can go online and look at it on YouTube, and about 26 minutes into it, he starts talking about the Rise Fund. And he said he's doing his diligence on TPG, and he concludes in his British accent, "Oh, those guys are motherfuckers." And he says
that was the worst British accent I've ever heard.
It was Irish. That wasn't British, that was Irish.
All right, it was spot on then, language and all.
So it sounds less awful when it's got the Irish accent than an American saying it, but he says this like multiple times, and my phone lights up with our external affairs guys saying, "Can you ask him to stop calling us that, please?" But his point was, if you can get the guys that are, wildly aggressive and commercial and diligent to build and fund these businesses that have this wonderful social impact, and it costs you 2 and 20, hallelujah, praise the Lord. We're delivering 13 times impact. Now that's a glib answer. It doesn't address the core question. At the end of the day, we have a problem. When you have a Ken Griffith paying $283 million for an apartment over here, you're gonna see the pitchforks come out. And I think we have a reckoning coming as a society on the way we think about work. Even, we invest in technology and innovation, robotics and AI and what's coming and what it means for we the people. Do we want to allow the few founders of Google to make all the money, or is it something that we're going to find a mature way to share as a society? These are all big issues that we have to address, no question.
I'm going to take the next question though.
Hi there, Alexandra Tesser with Dahlberg Advisors, Social Impact Advisor. My question is whether or not you've started applying these impact metrics to the Rise Fund or any other funds housed under TPG and the impact it's having on the broader conversation generally at the firm on impact.
So, is it contagious?
Yeah, so we definitely report on the Rise Fund. In fact, we in the latest issue of the Harvard Business Review, the methodologies we used has been published, so we're making it public. And we do annual reports audited by KPMG that all of our LPs receive, and we're starting to sort of let the world see it. We wanted to be at a point where we knew we'd done it, and we're really confident in it. And so we've actually had 80 different organizations pressure test the methodology and review it and all of that. So we are reporting on it. It's been interesting. It's not only creating competitors, but it's creating an interesting dialogue internally within the firm. When you see Bonderman out talking about impact investing and Coulter talking about impact investing, there's a real general alignment that we've had as a broader platform around the importance of this to society and to the world.
One more question, I think there. I'll try. Keep it really short.
Bill Vogelgesang, Epic Pie. We're an impact investment bank. I'm curious how many staff hours on average go into the calculation of MMI on each deal, and also can you give us a glimpse of the roadmap for Y Analytics?
Yeah, so it's gotten more and more efficient. You can imagine it was gruesome the first way through because we had to actually collect all the data, the hundreds of studies that have to be addressed to connect the output of a business to the social or environmental outcome and the pricing of it. It's getting much more efficient. I would say it's no different than when you think of the financial audits we go through, the quality of earnings diligence. I mean, our view is there's no real excuse because it's no different than any other sort of underwriting that you do in the world. It's not particularly gruesome. In our case, because KPMG wants to build a practice area, the net cost to our investors is less than in our other businesses because they're willing to support this effort with lower pricing overall for what they do with us. Y Analytics itself is scaling very dramatically. They're headquartered in DC. You can imagine the amount of inbound that they're getting from both investors, but also governments and corporations and others that are fascinated by what this could mean.
So we've time for just one more question, super short.
Thank you. Elsie Mayo. I'm the
Elsie.
CEO of Humanity, Inc. We help leaders align their business strategy with human values.
Wonderful.
And the challenge is, it relates to, I think, what you talked about, net impact. There's an assumption about weighting, how you weight the different impacts.
Yep.
And those have got to trace back to some kind of priorities.
So how do you do that?
How do you do that?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I think you're exactly right. I think step one is let's agree on a way we measure. And then step two is we then get to bring in the framework of what our values are as it relates to those degrees. I mean, one of the obvious points is there's certain of our sectors that create substantially more impact. And one of the obvious questions people ask is, why not do more there, right? From a societal perspective, the greater degree of impact. There's questions that arise around beyond just prioritization of that particular impact. How do we value that impact differently depending on the societal lens? The statistical value of human life, for example, is interesting. Everywhere you go in the world, there's literally a statistical value of human life for that particular society. That's been developed by the World Bank, by others, Deloitte. So India, it's $440,000. In the US, it's about $8 million. That's sort of abhorrent from a societal point of view. It's purely an economic equation around what output comes from that human being, the typical human being in that society. But it raises interesting questions but until we have a way of measuring to cut through the noise to say, here's what the quantified number would say, it's really hard to even have a conversation about it because it's all a tummy rub otherwise.
What a lovely
Use the technical term. Yep.